Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. I can project without a microphone. My name's Claire Massoud, and I just wanted to welcome you to our first Writers Speak event of this academic year. It's a real thrill to have Leslie Jamison with us. And I wanted to say thank you to our director, Professor Sunil Amrith, and to Professor Steve Beal, whose title also involves the word director and another word that I'm not sure what it is. And also to Lauren Doan, who has made everything happen, and to Jeff Mayerson and the Harvard Bookstore, who will be selling books. I just wanted to let you know that there will be the second and final Writers Speak event of this semester on October 28th, when the Libyan-British, now living part-time in America, writer Hisham Matar will be speaking. The book sale after the event will be right around the corner in the lounge. Leslie has asked me to let you guys know that she will be, in addition to signing books, she will be stamping books. She has special stamps. So, and that there is an act of reciprocity involved, and that you are asked to sign her book too. So, start thinking of something pithy to say now. Please silence your cell phones. So I'm going to do a super quick introduction for Leslie and one for James. Then James is going to introduce Leslie, and then Leslie's going to read, and then they're going to chat, and then you get your turn. Sound good? Okay. Welcome back to Leslie Jamison, a 2004 graduate from Harvard and an English concentrator, here, and an alum of the Advocate and the Signet Society, who then went on to an MFA at Iowa and a PhD in English literature at Yale. Leslie's the author of a novel, The Gin Closet, which came out in 2010, and of two earlier best-selling and beloved works of nonfiction, The Empathy Exams in 2014, and The Recovering Intoxication and Its Aftermath in 2018. Celebrated for her particular combination of personal memoir and essayistic reportage, Leslie is the director of nonfiction in the MFA program at Columbia University. Her new collection of essays, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, when's the pub date? When was it?
Last Tuesday.
It's been out for 1 week. And it's described by the LA Times in a review just a day old as fabulously quirky and unconventional, intelligent and vibrant, and her prose is hailed as sonorous and captivating. All apt adjectives indeed. We're so thrilled and honored to have you with us. Thank you, Leslie. James Wood is a professor of the practice of literary criticism, as well as a literary critic on staff at the New Yorker magazine. He's the author of 2 novels, most recently Upstate in 2018, and 5 books of criticism, including How Fiction Works, reissued in a 10th anniversary edition last year. His selected essays, Serious Noticing, will be published this winter. Formerly the literary critic of London's Guardian newspaper and of the New Republic magazine, James is also a longtime contributor to the London Review of Books. He will be in conversation with Leslie following her reading. He's also, on the full disclosure front, married to me. Over to you, James.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome Leslie Jamison to this room, to this campus. Like most of you, I first encountered her in the essays, probably like most of you, in the essays that became her book, The Empathy Exams, a series of adventures in empathy with others and empathy for oneself. The title essay recounts a time when Jamison found work as a so-called medical actor, someone who acts out the role of a standardized patient with certain fictional symptoms so that medical students can practice their empathy on said actor. Jamison uses the gift of this job to practice empathy on herself, among others, imagining the non-standard patient, imagining herself as both an ideally standardized patient and the impossibly non-standard patient she must actually be, a young woman who is drinking too much, who has to have an abortion, and whose irregular heartbeat requires the insertion of a pacemaker. The essay vibrates on the borderline between patience and impatience and questions the usefulness of empathy even as it demands the succor of its existence. It's deservedly celebrated for its formal ingenuity, its moral complexity, and brutal honesty. You can see it as a template for everything that was yet to come in Jamison's work, not least her stylistic brilliance, describing her pacemaker, for instance, as the barnacle of a false heart, or how empathy is a choice, something that needs to be worked at, practiced. Quote, it's made of exertion, that dowdier cousin of impulse. Jamison's next book, The Recovering, Intoxication and Its Aftermath, was published in 2017. And it's a long, supple, and shattering inquiry into addiction and recovery. Jamison's own alcoholism and the alcoholism of several writers, among them Raymond Carver, Jean Rhys, Malcolm Lowry, John Berryman, Dennis Johnson, and David Foster Wallace. It fearlessly examines the impulses of dependency and the causes of correction, the reasons for the destructive surrender of addiction, and the reasons for the constructive surrender of recovery. It's marvelously well written. On Carver's stories, quote, his stories were painful and precise, like carefully bitten fingernails. The ragged divinity of barfly living, that's on Malcolm Lowry. And there's a terrifying moment when the pregnant author, who has not stopped drinking, pictures the tiny damaged fetus inside her like a tiny ice cube cloaked in whiskey. But I'm most struck by that book's remarkable honesty, its openness toward human complexity. Jamison isn't afraid to see both the shame and the excitement, the battered prestige, in chronic drunkenness, even as she subjects herself and her chosen writers to pitiless critique. And she sees with cold generosity her own episodic narcissism, self-pity, and moral impossibility. More even than this, because anyone can be ashamed, she's ashamed and a little proud, which takes real honesty. Booze, she writes, was proof of extreme interior weather. If you needed to drink that much, you hurt, close quotes. And by implication, you were interesting. But by the same token, Jamison is not embarrassed by the earnest sincerity involved in recovery and the language of recovery. Like David Foster Wallace, whose novel Infinite Jest she came to rely on, she learns to embrace the very thing that late modern writers are supposed to disdain: cliché, irony, cliché, sincerity, simplicity. Her latest book of essays, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, is, if anything, even more intimate, self-reckoning, and porously empathetic than her earlier work. Jamison opens herself up to a great range of subjects. There are essays about photography, about giving birth, about how people project their pain and fantasy onto certain animals, a whale, in the first essay, or constructions, the virtual reality platform Second Life. Jamison frequently battles her own skepticism. In an essay about children who have reported remembering past lives, she has to suspend her own suspiciousness around such psychic fancy, an operation that involves doing battle with the bullshit-detecting irony of one of her essayistic predecessors, Joan Didion. Jamison, in the end, doesn't care for Didion's skepticism around how we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Quote, I have my doubts about her doubt, she writes. A final suite of essays tells us about Jamison's love of her brother, her marriage to Charles Bock, her role as a stepmother to a little girl, and finally, rapturously, her pregnancy and the birth of her daughter, Ione. Those essays dare something new in her work, I think, the intimacy of ordinariness, a blessed banality she thought she might never want, let alone cherish. Leslie Jamison.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Good. Thank you, James, for that introduction, and thank you, Claire. Thank you to both of you for hosting me here. Thank you, Lauren, for putting everything together. I don't know if Lauren. Yeah, it's really, I was saying to Claire earlier how much it means to me to be back here. I've been really sort of deep in memory over the past 24 hours, but in this layered way of bringing my daughter, who's almost 2, to all these places that were part of shaping me when I was young, the places where I lived and the places where I studied. To teach at Barker Center today was incredibly meaningful to me. So it's wonderful to be back. I'm excited to talk to James. I'm excited to hear from all of you. I thought that I would read a bit from the title essay in this collection, in part because it gave the collection its name, and in part because it's at the very beginning, at least, about a Harvard freshman. So it felt right. This is Make It Scream, Make It Burn. And I'm going to start from the beginning, so it doesn't need much introduction, but because I won't get to the whole thing, I guess I'll say it's really looking at James Agee's classic text, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, but thinking about that text in relation to Agee's first draft, which was a much shorter magazine piece he wrote about 3 sharecropper families in Alabama that ended up getting rejected, and instead of shelving it, he wrote another 400 pages, and which is itself something worth remembering. Yeah, it's to me, it's this powerful looking at that work and looking at a bit of the process of that work that gets revealed in looking at that first draft, is this kind of beautiful, passionate, difficult inquiry into how it is that we make things at all, and how it is that we understand ourselves as citizens of the world and accountable to the world and accountable to pain in the world, all of which are things that Agee, though he frustrates me and angers me and makes me feel all the things, he also feels like company in some of those primal struggles. So here it is, Make It Scream, Make It Burn. In the summer of 1929, after completing his freshman year at Harvard, James Agee headed west to spend a few months working as a migrant farmhand. As he wrote to Dwight MacDonald, his fellow Exeter alum, longtime friend, and eventual boss at Fortune magazine, he had grand visions for what the summer would hold. "I'm going to spend the summer working in the wheat fields," he wrote, starting in Oklahoma in June. "The thing looks good in every way. I've never worked and greatly prefer such a job. I like to get drunk and will. I like to sing and learn both dirty songs and hobo ones. And will. I like to be on my own. The farther from home, the better. And will." It's an amusing letter. Agee has never worked, but knows he'll enjoy it. He has gotten drunk, and he knows he'll enjoy that too. There's a sense of manifest destiny in his hypnotic syntax, a grammatical insistence on the fulfillment of desire. I like to and will. I like to and will. I like to and will. He fantasizes about camaraderie and distraction. He wants to be delivered from his own interior life. He's done too much hard time with too many sonnet writers in Harvard Yard. He wants, this is like, I knew this was the right room, the laughter of resonance. He wants out. The thing looks good in every way. As it turned out, it wasn't. "Kansas is the most utterly lousy state I've ever seen," he wrote MacDonald on, quote, maybe August 1st. He continued, "Am now working at hauling and scooping grain on a combine crew. I rammed a pitchfork into my Achilles tendon." Agee paints a vivid portrait of himself suffering under the heartland heat, hobbling along a dusty road, raising grain-dusted fingers to put scare quotes around his newly inherited life. But it's also clear he took pleasure in the hardship he described, or at least he took pleasure in describing it. He signs off, "Have to tackle a load now, Jim." At that point in his life, Agee's manual labor didn't have much to do with his creative work back home. At Harvard in the fall, he'd been focused mainly on getting elected to the editorial board of The Advocate, campus literary magazine, and composing dubious love lyrics to his long-distance girlfriend, to whom he was, painfully it seems, trying to remain faithful. Quote, "I murdered joy that your love might abide. A precious skeleton lies at my side." It was just ended like 6 long-distance relationships in this room. It was it was largely anxiety about this girlfriend and their joy-murdering relationship that had made Agee so eager to work the fields in the first place. "It will be hellishly bad work," he wrote, "so for once I won't have a chance to worry and feel like hell all summer." His letter imagines hard labor as liberation. It's absurd, of course, but Agee acknowledges his own absurdity before anyone else could possibly call him out on it. "I'm afraid it sounds a little as if I were a lousy bohemian and lover of the earthy, but I assume I'm nothing so foul, quite, as that." He is aware of how naive he sounds as soon as he sounds that way. This preemptive self-excoriation would eventually become one of his hallmarks. Agee's early letters bear so many traces of his later voice, a fascination with worlds far removed from his own, an anguished reeling between judging and valorizing his encounters, and an abiding obsession with the relationship between hard labor and interior life. How does feeling reside inside a body that works all day long? Does that kind of brutal monotony banish consciousness? Is it degrading to suggest that it does, to deny it? The thing looks good in every way. 7 years later, Agee would indict the thing from every angle possible. Researched in 1936 and eventually published in 1941, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, Agee's sui generis work of sprawling lyric reportage wrestles with the material lives of 3 sharecropper families in rural Alabama. The book describes their homes and the necessities of their daily labor. It catalogs their clothes and meals and physical possessions, their illnesses and their expenses. But it also forces us into the anguish of Agee's attempt to do this describing, as if his attempt were another house, a labyrinthine architecture of thwarted narratives and self-sabotaging journalism, built of convoluted syntax and tortuous abstractions, charged by feelings of attachment and, beyond and beneath all else, guilt. The book is exhaustive and exhausting. It is tormented about what it finds beautiful. Sometimes it doesn't even want to exist. "If I could do it, I'd do no writing at all here," Agee announces at the start of the book. "It would be photographs. The rest would be fragments of cloth, bits of cotton, lumps of earth, records of speech, pieces of wood and iron, files of odors, plates of food and of excrement. A piece of the body torn out by the roots might be more to the point." He'd do no writing at all, besides the 400 pages he ended up writing. He hadn't worked, but knew he'd like it. Now he had worked at writing this book, a thankless job, and knew he didn't like what his labor had made, but offered it anyway, because what else could he do? This was what he'd done. The project of praise began when Fortune sent Agee to Alabama on assignment during the summer of 1936. He traveled with Walker Evans, whose accompanying photographs would become as famous as Agee's words. "Best break I ever had on Fortune," Agee wrote in a letter. "Feel terrific personal responsibility toward story, considerable doubts of my ability to bring it off, considerable more of Fortune's ultimate willingness to use it as it seems, in theory, to me." Evans described how this sense of terrific personal responsibility shaped Agee's research. Quote, Agee worked in what looked like a rush and a rage. In Alabama, he was possessed with the business, jamming it all into days and the nights. He must not have slept. Agee's doubts about his ability to bring it off only deepened once the business itself was done. As he wrote to Father James Harold Fly, a teacher at his Episcopal boys' school in Sewanee and one of his great lifelong mentors, quote, everything there was unpredictable from day to day. I was half crazy with the heat and diet. The trip was very hard and certainly one of the best things I've ever had happen to me. Writing what we found is a different matter. Impossible in any form and length fortune can use, and I am now so stultified trying to do that I'm afraid I've lost the ability to make it right in my own way. Agee was on staff at Fortune, outfitted with an office in the Chrysler Building back in Manhattan, where he went on all-night whiskey benders turning out copy about cockfighting and the Tennessee Valley Authority. But he was right to doubt their, quote, ultimate willingness to publish. The magazine killed the piece in late 1936. At that point, Agee began looking for other ways to write and publish the material. He applied for a Guggenheim grant, calling his project, quote, an Alabama record, and describing it as an attempt to tell everything possible as accurately as possible with as total a suspicion of creative and artistic as of repertorial attitudes and methods, and, humbly, quote, likely to involve the development of some more or less new forms of writing. He didn't get the grant. Eventually, he got a small advance from a publishing house, so he holed up in New Jersey and began expanding his original article into the glorious sprawl that would eventually become Praise. The book was published to little fanfare in 1941, sold about 600 copies, a few hundred more in remainders, and was, in MacDonald's words, a commercial failure in every sense. Not until its 1960 re-release did the book catch fire, fueled by the energy of the civil rights movement and appreciated by a readership primed for the rich narrative texture of the new journalism. Lionel Trilling would eventually call Praise, quote, the most realistic and most important moral effort of our American generation, arguing not only for its cultural stature, but also for the ways in which it could shift our expectations about what realism might mean and the kinds of messy, emotive texture that realistic portraits of human existence might require. In the meantime, it was generally believed that the original manuscripts of Agee's magazine article had been destroyed or lost for good, until his daughter discovered it in a collection of manuscripts that had been sitting in his Greenwich Village home for years, a 30,000-word typescript simply titled Cotton Tenants. Reading this carefully structured original draft alongside the unspooling book it eventually became offers a split-screen glimpse into the process of witnessing itself. How does the morally outraged mind begin to arrange its materials? And then, once it begins to doubt itself, how does it rearrange them all over again? And I'm going to read, actually, from the last few paragraphs in the essay as well. Although I promise there's some really good stuff in between, so you should read the rest of the essay too. Jacob Riis describes how he once fought the impulse to cry out at a city planning meeting when a builder called for designing more humane apartments. I wanted to jump in my seat at that time and shout, "Amen," Riis writes, but I remembered that I was a reporter and kept still. He wrote the other half instead. It was his way of trying to make the world a place that could deserve an amen. It was an accusation and an exhortation, a prayer directed at the entire city. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is a prayer, but it is also an admonishment. To read it, says writer William T. Volman, is to be, quote, slapped in the face. Agee wasn't thinking just about himself, his own guilt, his own love, his own arms flung hopelessly around his subjects. He was thinking about you, reading his words, what you could see and what you couldn't. He wanted to throw a pile of excrement on your open notebook and let you figure it out. The dilemma of impotence, the quest to keep speaking and the inability to ever say enough, is one of Agee's great legacies. It choked and spurred his speech. But Agee's legacy isn't merely his sublime articulation of futility. His legacy isn't just journalistic skepticism. It is his attempt to find a language for skepticism and to rewrite journalism in this language, to insist upon a sincerity that lies on the far side of self-interrogation. In the 400-odd pages of praise, we find a lot of guilt, but we also find a lot of research. The rough draft of Tenets helps us remember this. It lets us witness what Agee made first and examine it alongside the epic it became once it got digested by the organs of an endless self-loathing. In Tenets, we have the first failure in a long line of failures, all of them filled with rush and rage, all of them beautiful. We have the first record of eloquence before it learned to scream. Tenets summons a you and extends an invitation that becomes a command. You can look. You must. Look at what Agee wrote when he remembered he was a reporter and wouldn't keep still, wouldn't keep quiet. Look what happened when he sought an amen and found these words instead. Now look closer. You can feel him getting restless. You can hear the rustling of his guilt like the beginning of a brush fire. Thanks.
So I was saying to my students yesterday, we were discussing your essay in defense of saccharin. You're now on the syllabus, right? You haven't just come back to university, on the syllabus. And I was reminding them that one fact about contemporary literature is that essentially from about the 50s onwards, writing has increasingly is being produced by people who studied at a university. And that marks quite a shift between us and previous ages. And I just wanted to start that, thinking about that in relation to, here you are coming back to a place that you studied literature at. You went on to do a great deal more study, both in creative writing and doing a PhD. And it's a powerful dynamic in your work too, I think, that you're a very good reader of yourself and other people and of texts, as you've just displayed, and you're paradoxically much less good at living often, or have been, right? I mean, that's something you write.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested in how that, right? It's not.
Wasn't what I was expecting you were to say, yeah.
Right? Okay, let's make it general. We're all goodish readers, and we're all terrible at living. But it is obviously something that you come back to again and again. So I just really wanted to ask you, first of all, what kind of impact you think being trained to read texts has made on you as a writer?
Yeah, and then I have definitely things to say about that, and also things to say maybe about the second part too, about that disconnect between reading and living, or that disconnect between self-awareness and self-transformation, and the ways in which maybe that connects to some of the thinking about failure that is happening in this book, or what's generative about failure. I mean, I feel so deeply constituted by really I feel like a palimpsest inside of everything that I've ever read, and some things in that palimpsest loom larger than others, but so many of those texts were brought to me, bless you, through classrooms and through those discussions. And so I think in a way, and especially coming back here and coming back to the Barker Center today, I was having these very embodied sense memories of being in certain classrooms, the classroom where I studied poetry with Jory Graham, or the basement classroom where I studied poetry with Peter Sachs, or reading many, many texts of 18th century travel literature in that little seminar room that overlooks the atrium. And I think that for me, like the ways in which those Wendler's Whitman seminar, which was like hugely formative for me, and so just remembering those classrooms, but also remembering those classrooms and what I read in these very bodily ways, like being in that building again. I think that's so much of what my writing practice ultimately comes back to, is how all of these different ways of absorbing the world are living alongside each other, like what we read, what our bodies do, where our bodies have been, that those don't exist in separate compartments, right? They're always a kind of speaking to each other inside of us. And so in that sense, like, I think there can be these easy or reductive narratives about how too much programming around contemporary writers, or these contemporary writers coming out of MFA programs, can sort of impose a kind of cookie cutter stylistic approach, or that you can sort of recognize MFA writers because they all write the same, and that there's something sort of getting increasingly institutionalized about how we write. And there's been really smart thinking and writing about that. But to me, I don't think that will ever feel true, or I don't see the truth in that, because I think the writing is only ever as flat as the veins of literary influence that are coming into it. And if those veins are varied and multiple and dynamic and alive, then the writing is going to remain that way in response to them. So, so to me, it feels like, yeah, those classrooms are there, but those classrooms, like, they were really surprising and dynamic places.
So if you'd skipped Iowa, I mean, I know a lot of things, you've experienced a lot of things in Iowa, and you've written them about them, particularly in the recovering, but if you'd skipped Iowa and just gone straight to graduate school, how would your writing, what did you learn as a writer at Iowa, apart from the fact that you had time, which is so precious, as you say, to read more literature? I mean, I think part of it was as simple as, just like having space and prompting to write, and like less that it was like I got a series of lessons and internalized them, and once I got, good at all the lessons, then I could produce competent fiction. It's more like, I think you write and write and write, and you fail and fail and fail, or you don't quite hit the vein and don't quite hit the vein, and then, at least for me, and then maybe you, after years of that, you find some new voice, and it's not necessarily clear why you had to write the 7 mediocre stories before you could write the 8th story that had found something, but you kind of do. And actually, to come back to that Wendler seminar again, one of the Whitman poems that I first met in the Barker Center that has meant a lot to me in the years since is that poem, This Compost, and the idea of, well, in that case, trying to think about the carnage of the Civil War in terms of compost and how the dead are living always underneath our feet, or not living, but are existing always underneath our feet. I mean, there was a powerful sort of national project at work in that poem, but when I think about most of experience, I often come back to that image of composting, and how even if we can't understand the mechanisms by which what we've lived, or the ways in which our failures kind of constitute what we're able to do next, I really believe in that process of composting. And so I think Iowa gave me opportunities to write the 7 mediocre stories I needed to write in order to write, because there really is only one thing I wrote at Iowa that I think was any good, but I needed to write all the things around it before I could get there. So I think it gave me time. I think it gave me a sort of a sense of muscle memory for how the process needed to work, that you needed to keep showing up for uncertainty and failure before you showed up to the thing that felt like it could sing. And then I think there were certain truths about writing that I absorbed while I was there,
one of the ones that comes to mind is like things that I learned in the classroom from teachers that I wouldn't have come to otherwise, or maybe my life would have delivered me in some different way to them. But one of the ones that I often come back to is an idea that one of my final teacher there, who was the fiction writer and essayist Charlie D'Ambrosio, he talked to us a lot about the ways in which the problem with a piece of literature could become either its subject or a way into renovating it and giving it what it needed, so that you could sort of either that you could diagnose what a story needed through, say, flaws in its sentences or flaws in its syntax, or that you could actually, in the case of certain essays, take the thing that felt like a liability, like say in the essay you were mentioning in your introduction, the empathy exams. When Charlie first read that essay, he said, you know, when you write about your own pain, you have this kind of clinical distance, and that piece of feedback or that critique was part of what gave me the idea of narrating my own experiences almost as if they were clinical dossiers, which was a formal experiment that ended up actually allowing me to narrate the emotional experiences in them much more fully.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the form of these essays. I mean, the beautiful way you interpolate autobiography into often history or reportage, but also just the whole idea of interrogation, right? You talk about interrogated sentimentality in defense of Sakharine, and just hearing you now reading the essay about Agee, it's clear how much he means to you and how much that notion of preemptive self-excoriation, you know, is meaningful to you. I suppose the question I have is, and I know it's one that you wrestle with because it seems to me, looking at your work, that there's half of you craves a kind of simplicity that will get beyond an endlessly additive self-excoriation, self-examination. And then there's another half of you that is absolutely committed to it, both in principle, but also perhaps more haplessly, right? Well, what's the question? What is the question? This is the thing. It's always easy to say what the... So the question is, do you feel... Is that a dynamic that sounds right that I'm describing? And if so, and obviously it's there, I think, in David Foster Wallace's work too. So does one need to talk about having an escape from that? Is there an escape from it, or is that just the wrong way? Is that me, the moralist, sort of imposing a kind of, maybe that's an absurd way to think about it.
Yeah.
One can oscillate between a desire to escape and the inability to escape from endless self-examination.
Yeah. Well, first of all, absolutely that tension or that dynamic or that oscillation feels very accurate to me as a characterization of a lot of the work, and probably a lot of the life as well. And I think when I, in that last portion I read when I talked about Agee wanting to believe in something on the other side, to insist upon a sincerity that lies on the far side of self-interrogation, I think that is one way of thinking about what I often feel like I'm striving for is to find this point of landing that is a sincere point of landing, and that's something that I do stand behind, and actually something I believe that you can stand behind even if you haven't gone through the endless process of self-interrogation to get there. Like the final lines in empathy exams are, I want our hearts to be open. I just wrote that. I mean it. I want our hearts to be open. And obviously there's a kind of self-awareness in there when I say I just wrote that. It's like acknowledging that there are people out there who would say, I can't believe you just wrote that. I want our hearts to be open. But the hope or the idea is that you arrive at that simple statement in a very different way because you've read 240 pages in the case of that book of really wrestling with, well, what does that mean? Why is that a good thing for our hearts to be open? What is achieved in that openness? Is it possible for our hearts to ever really comprehend anything about another person's heart? Like trying to kind of break down every piece of that and then land on it anyway is sort of it's not quite the same structurally as just oscillating back and forth between two things and endlessly not resolving the battle between them. It's sort of saying, oh, when we can get to this simple statement, maybe it can mean something more by virtue of holding the residue of all the wrestling that's come. And it makes me think about something actually that you and Claire and I were talking about just before the event when you asked if I'd had any downtime. And I said no, because when I'm in between teaching here and speaking here, right, I'm mainly with my toddler, but that and so it doesn't, like, as most people probably who've spent time with a 2-year-old wouldn't describe it as like downtime, but
So when they're asleep.
when there's, and actually, to be fair, she was asleep for part of the afternoon, but that it was two, it's two different kinds of exhausting to be with a toddler and to be, speaking about the aesthetics of self-interrogation. They use different muscles, and but that I think there is something useful in that counterpoint. I mean, in that case, I'm thinking about the toddler time as involving a certain kind of simplicity that's like about being a body alongside this other body you love and want to help survive, and exploring the world in this very physical way, and that's different from the sort of endless processing and self-awareness of writing and thinking about writing and talking about writing, but that I ultimately I'm so interested in how the simplicity and the complexity speak to each other. And it's like what we were talking about. Some people here were in this session on keeping a notebook or a diary that I was leading earlier today, and part of what's very moving to me about reading the diaries and notebooks of others is the way that they become transcriptions or transcriptions of that conversation between complexity and simplicity, where you see Susan Sontag writing about what she ate for lunch and then trying to sketch out her ideas about camp, and both of those were happening in the same day. She ate lunch and she thought about camp, so.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but when you read then Sontag's essays, do you feel that admission is missing? Do you, even as you enjoy her and admire her, do you feel, okay, that you could have built that into the essay?
Right, as opposed to it just being in the diary. Yeah. I mean, when it comes to like questions of taste, I sometimes do miss it, and I guess, some of the examples that people often come back to with her work are illness as metaphor, and to write a whole book about, metaphorizing cancer without narrating your own experience of cancer, even alluding to it, or AIDS and its metaphors, and to write that book without, talking about being part of a queer community. And, ultimately, and I guess I kind of think about this pedagogically too, like when I teach a workshop, my goal is not to tell my students like what they should write, like, oh, you shouldn't write this essay, you should write this other essay that's personal narrative. But I do think that often the writing that moves me the most, part of why and how it moves me, is that it finds a way somehow to move between the scales of the granular and the personal and the emotional and that other scale of the analytic or the conceptual, because they're never separate in lived experience. And so I like when literature finds ways of bringing them together. It doesn't have to be confessional, autobiographical, nonfiction narrative that brings that scale of the personal or the emotional in, but I think it is the
variousness is what, I totally get that. You've written brilliantly about, and so movingly about addiction and recovery, and I just wanted to ask, I wanted to ask you about sort of structures of addiction. It's somewhat rhetorical, may I ask you this, because you've written you've asked all the questions and answered them so well that there's a slight foolishness in this pantomime that we're engaged in. But there was my self-reflexive moment.
It's like a contagion.
That's why that's like when Leslie breaks into one of her essays and says, "I was on an assignment and being paid, so and so for this glossy magazine, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do this instead." But you've written so well about these structures, and you've written very honestly about how to be addicted to drugs or alcohol is, of course, to be addicted to other things too, oneself. You're very upfront about that. it's to be addicted to desire itself, wanting more. I think wonderfully you write about in the recovery about how for you, I mean, when you discovered that anorexia and alcoholism really weren't very distinct. Both of them involved an obsession that shamed you, the sense of being consumed by a desire that was so limited in its object. If addiction is addiction to desire and to the self, how do you ever get beyond it? I mean, how does anyone get beyond it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's funny, when you were setting up that question, you treated it as if it was something I had already answered, which is funny because I
suspect you have. But
I haven't answered how we make addiction go away. But I think I do often, one of the definitions of addiction that spoke to me most fully in the course of researching and writing that book and sort of living what the lived material that became part of that book was a clinician at Johns Hopkins who described addiction as a limiting of repertoire, that your sort of world gets small around a certain thing. And, it's what David Foster Wallace finds his own, like, crazy, absurd way of dramatizing an infinite jest, which, for those who haven't read it, this isn't really a spoiler. It's like the novel is organized around this kind of a cartridge, which is like a video technology, where when you see this cartridge, you never want to do anything ever again except for watch it over and over and over again. And that cartridge becomes part of the way that he talks about other kinds of more recognizable addiction that are all through that book: crack and booze and pot and the self and desire and sex and, all the things that we want endlessly or encounter the endlessness of our desires. But I think the idea of that limiting of repertoire and sort of the way that the rest of the world goes away because you only want this one thing,
right.
it is a kind of frightening core of addiction, I think. And so one of the ways out of it, I think, on a kind of psychological level, which isn't to discount all the things that are important to talk about with addiction on a physiological level, right? Like sometimes the way out of it might need to be, buprenorphine or methadone or, and so I don't want to sort of speak as if it's like all about a psychological readjustment or something. I think there are also real physical realities there. But I think that sense of finding some way to, like, take the limited repertoire and make it large again and sort of tune into the world in its vastness and its infinitude, and different people find different ways to tune into that vastness. But I think that was part of what I love about the essay as a form, and even doubly so, part of what I love about the essay collection as a form is that it can go deep into its central consciousness, the consciousness of the narrator, the I, and also remain tuned in to the size of the world and the infinitude of the world. And part of what I loved about putting this collection together was the ways in which it could both go deep into the self, but also involve a lot of criticism and reportage, which are not the only ways, but are some ways to kind of bring in the size of the world. The people who become obsessed with the loneliest whale in the world, the people who construct stories around prior lives, the people who spend 12 hours a day in these elaborately curated digital lives online. Like, spending years reporting those pieces was, for me, I think, experientially as well as aesthetically, a way of tuning into the world in its size.
Yeah. The idea of expanding the range of addiction in a way, in a sense, makes a lot of sense. But are you then still stuck with just a larger range of addictions? I mean, the narrow focus is gone, but then I guess we're all addicted to desire, right? We're all variously addicted to ourselves, right? What do you do with that? Particularly if that's been the structure of the narrower addiction. That's what really interests me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder.
I mean, but I'm talking nonsense. I don't know.
No.
I don't know about the structure of the narrow
If
addiction.
it's
so
nonsense, it's the only nonsense I ever speak. So it's speaking my language, James. But I think it's, yeah, I mean, I think I guess the first thing I'll say is I think for me, part of what's toxic about addiction is the narrowing. So if a kind of addictive self can apply that addictive curiosity or that sort of obsessive desire to absorb or learn or pay attention to like a polyculture of things rather than a monoculture of things or many things rather than just the one thing, then I think it has actually thwarted some of what's toxic. I think when you talk about being like addicted to desire itself, I think part of the way out of that is, and part of what I was trying to map in some of these essays is like structures of desire, I think, are often about projecting the sort of ideal version of a thing that you don't yet have or maybe can't ever have. And so to desire something endlessly or to long for something endlessly is sort of to long for this perfect distant version of it. And that I think the way out of that, it's kind of like endless cycle of like longing for the thing you can't have or longing for the thing when it's far away, is to also try to figure out how to be with things close up, how to be with things in a daily way, how to be with people in their flawedness and their complexity, how to show up for relationships that are many things at once, to sort of replace the perfect distant vision with the close, proximate, messy, imperfect one, which feels like a very non-addictive way of being, right? To me, to just like show up for dailiness and imperfection.
Right, and that's something you write really beautifully about at the end, towards the end of the book, with the more personal essays, where you're writing about giving birth, about marriage, about the ordinariness of your brother's life that seemed when you were younger, staid, inaccessible, admirable, but not yours. Is that going to, so if that is very much the texture of your life at the moment, something that in a different context you called unblind wellness. I like that phrase, unblind wellness. But if unblind wellness is what you're about and after right now, is that going to produce a different kind of essay? Has it already produced a different kind of essay? Are those essays at the end a little different from the earlier ones?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I've also started to think about working on a novel again, which is maybe another genre answer to that dilemma, to imagine things that aren't. But yeah, I mean, I do think that structures of experience that are ongoing and that aren't totally constituted by like rupture or things going wrong, that are about sort of showing up for daily experience and then involve kind of paying attention to what might be glorious and the things we're tempted to call mundane. Like, I do think those ask for different structures, although the ask is maybe a little bit different each time. So, the essay I write about stepmothers sort of, I mean, there's quite a bit of difficulty also in that. It is an essay about dailiness and caregiving.
And giving birth isn't ordinary. So, I mean, just to...
Well, but that's part of what's fascinating about giving birth, is like giving birth is ordinary. Like, it's literally the most common experience in the world. We're all here because it happened. But the fact that it's common doesn't make it any less meaningful. It doesn't make it any less intense, and it doesn't make it... And I think we have this weird cultural logic that like associates intensity and singularity, when of course most of the most intense things that happen to us aren't singular at all, and they're not unusual. And by demanding that something be unusual in order to sort of earn its place, I don't know. I would be curious actually for your thoughts on this. I think it's something we've accepted in literary fiction for quite some time, that like ordinary experience is absolutely the stuff of art, but I think in nonfiction it's somehow harder to arrive at that truth that ordinary things are like the stuff of art. But they are. I think they are, no matter what the genre is. And so that's why giving birth is both ordinary and.
I wonder if that's in part a formal thing, that, I mean, that when we think about certainly novels, we think about the patience of a long form, that is then hospitable to a great deal of ordinariness.
Yeah.
Whereas essays are
Yeah.
right.
Right.
You
You have
maybe that, I don't know.
There's more of an expectation of that burst of
Yeah.
intensity, or yeah. Um,
Yeah.
But I think there are different ways of I think there are different forms, I guess, that ordinariness can ask for. And, in the case of the stepmother piece, I'm also, there's quite a bit of personal narrative, but I'm also really looking at a whole tradition of the stepmother archetype and how that archetype shows up in fairy tales, in historical records, and, how the really fascinating ways by which the sort of vilified figure of the witch gives way to the vilified figure of the stepmother. But basically, in terms of form and structure, the essay is living inside daily experiences, like picking a little girl up and taking her to ballet class, but it's also thinking about the relationship between those ordinary experiences and like centuries of storytelling. Or in the final essay, which is very much about the ordinary experience of pregnancy, it's putting that conversation in relation to a narrative strand from 15 years earlier of an eating disorder. And so in that sense, there's sort of, it's illuminating the unbland wellness of pregnancy by putting it in relation to unwellness in a stark way.
Is that how you keep the sort of the texture of interrogation going, right?
I think so, partially. I mean, really with that piece, it actually started out as two separate essays, where there was an essay about the eating disorder that was formally experimental in a different way, and then an essay about pregnancy. And I realized each strand on their own didn't have quite the right charge, or didn't feel quite motivated enough. Maybe it didn't have a strong enough question at its core. And eventually my editor asked me, like, are you sure that this eating disorder essay needs to be in this collection? And I said, well, I really like the way it speaks to the pregnancy essay at the end. And as soon as I said that to him, I realized if I was invested in the ways if my main investment was in the ways those two experiences were speaking to each other, I needed to actually make them speak to each other, rather than just having them speak to each other in that sort of vague, permissive, two things in the same book are always speaking to each other somehow, in some way, like, I was like, no, I really need to figure out what exactly it is that they're saying to each other. And in that case, it is like when you formally braid two things together, you force yourself to think a lot harder about the specificity of that exchange. Right.
Did you publish, had that been published anywhere? So this is the first. And that was, how many of the essays are, and we'll soon get to questions, how many of those essays have been, or, I mean, how many are not published before?
Most of them were published. So the pregnancy essay, and the essay about Las Vegas and marriage, and the essay about the photographer Annie Appel. 3 very different essays.
Had not appeared.
Had not been published anywhere. And the essay about the layover, I mean, that one came out just right around the time of publication. But there's an essay about, it was funny, somebody in an introduction recently was like, Leslie Jamison covers topics as diverse as reincarnation, digital avatars, and airport layovers. And I was like, oh God, that really sells the book. But there is fair enough, because there is a whole essay about a layover in here.
I did see the layover one. That's very good. So I've got a final question, and then we'll go to the audience. And I think I might have I hope that this is one you can't answer.
Oh, good.
So as someone who was brought up in a very religious household, I'm very alert to religious structures, and particularly to the presence of guilt, which was the thing you are most responsive to, not surprisingly, in James Agee, and which I think absolutely drives your work, guilt and shame. Along with some other religious structures like atonement and so on.
I love this question already,
As far as I know, you had the opposite of a religious upbringing. So where did they come from? Where are the Jamison pastors who are in their frock coats?
I should ask
breathing down.
My family's in the second row, so maybe I should ask them where the Jamison guilt comes from. I think that it's probably easier. What did you? It was a rhetorical question. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's easier for me to locate the sources or origins of shame than of guilt, which is itself an interesting. I mean, shame maybe has more to do with how one fears being seen or being seen in some way that feels like it's calling out some rot at the core versus the internal experience of it. I think that I always had some sense of something being not quite right or not quite enough inside of me, and I don't actually think that that's talk about things being common. I don't think that's a particularly unusual way to feel, but I would say I didn't grow up in a strongly religious way, so the language that was attached to that feeling of something being a bit wrong inside wasn't a moralistic language of sort of original sin or something like that.
The opposite of religion. I didn't mean that you grew up in a crazy immoral household. I simply meant there wasn't a lot of religious presence as far as I knew.
Have even more to write about if that was true. No, I think I think it was almost like because I mean the kind of religion of my home, if anything, was the religion of excellence or of doing things well, and so I think that sort of the sacredness of like achieving and being good enough was more, that was the kind of language in which that sense of inbuilt insufficiency was articulated, was somehow I have to be good enough in the sense of achievement rather than good enough in the sense of morality, right? But I think it's been interesting because my relationship to spirituality has sort of deepened a lot in the last decade, and it does feel, to me more than anything, very connected to what we were talking about earlier about finding ways to not only to tune into the size of the world, but to the sense of being small inside the world. I've been really, really obsessed over the last few months with this Gary Winogrand photography exhibit in Brooklyn, and part of what I love about it, it's this sort of darkened hallway. Have you been?
No.
It's really gorgeous, but it's this darkened hallway of his color photographs projected as slides onto the walls, and there's 16 at any given time, but they're in constant rotation, and it really feels like a secular church. It feels like a church of the human. It's these human lives that are quite ordinary and quite beautiful, and I like part of what I like about going there is that I feel small in a really good way, and that sort of feels like one of the closest things to a kind of spiritual experience that I've had. So.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie, and we can now take got sort of 20 minutes, half an hour to take questions from the audience. Anyone who has a question? Yeah. Oh, and a microphone is on its way,
I think it's, I have like 50 million I could ask, but I can only ask one. I was thinking about, I guess it's like a question and a comment. I was thinking about like as someone who's been in different kinds of recovery myself, the religious framework of it, of like a lot of recovery-based programs. Do you think that informed like sort of the almost like religious framework you had in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think there are certain things that my writing is seeking or wants that are related to some of the religious frameworks that show up in religious institutions, but also show up in recovery around both ways that are kind of really related to what we were just talking about, sort of ways of feeling small in a good way, or ways of feeling in contact with or finding some faith in something kind of bigger than you can see the edges of, or something more complicated than you can comprehend. That sometimes how we talk about that is like believing in God, but like there's another way of thinking about it, which is to say like sort of believing in the presence of something more complicated than you can understand. And I think in that way, like commitment to literature is also an act of faith, right? Insofar as it's a commitment to something more complicated than you can understand, or that's sort of the desire to bring your consciousness up against something larger than you can see the edges of, I think is a very religious desire, but it's also a desire that can express itself in a lot of other ways. And I think my writing is really interested in like, what's the thing that's larger that I can see the edges of, and how can I kind of narrate experiences of coming up against that threshold? How can the writing itself create some version of that threshold? And I also think like kind of possibilities of grace and where grace lives. And I just did this conversation for the Paris Review with this poet, Kaveh Akbar, whose work I would recommend to everybody. He's a really phenomenal poet, and he's really interested in grace and the way that grace lives in ordinary moments. So I think that again is a, religious faith traditions have a certain way of talking about grace, but there are lots of ways investigating the possibilities of grace, and I think my work is really, it's almost like it shares that hunger with religious frameworks or religious pursuits, but doesn't always share a sense of like the same means or the same method. Yeah, I love your heart and your boots. Yeah, yeah.
Hi. I just went to a wedding last weekend, and then on Monday ended up reading the essay on weddings that was like just published somewhere on the internet. And I was struck by your one line about sort of a moment being a little too sweet, but it's yours. And it just got me thinking about writing in general and sort of personal writing and how you come to kind of regard that because it's both yours and not yours once it's out in the world. And I guess, it's something I want to ask a lot of writers, but like, what is your relationship to your writing, I guess, and how that relates to your life itself, and having to talk about it so much? Because it seems like it would be sort of hard.
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually your framing of the question itself begins to answer the question, which is to say that one of the things that I don't love everything about work going into the world, especially when it involves or has sort of some of the materials that the work has arranged or drawn upon or excavated are personal or are materials from my own lived experience that can make its entry into the world even harder or more charged or more fraught. But one of the things I do love is the way in which, and this gets to what you were saying about how something is simultaneously kind of yours and not yours anymore when you put it out in the world. I do love the way that something I've written gets implicated in 1,000 experiences that I don't know or can't fully imagine. So that essay about weddings is now involved in your consciousness about weddings and the wedding that you just came back from and the next wedding you'll go to in ways that I can't know and won't ever know, but I love that it's part of that kind of tapestry. And so in that sense, there's a relinquishment or a relinquishing of owning the thing that feels really good, because it's the work is taking up resonance inside of all of these lives, or becoming implicated in processes of meaning making or making sense of the world, or how do I live in the world, or what is my experience of a wedding as a beginning and also an ending, and I love that the work is becoming part of other lives in these ways that I can't fully see or understand. Maybe it's related to the first question too, because it's when the writing goes out into the world, it becomes part of something that I can't see the edges of anymore. I can see the edges of the essay itself, but I can't see the edges of how it's been received, and that sort of, it's humbling and terrifying and exciting and all of those things at once. But in terms of the kind of emotional aspects of putting it into the world, I do think it's also a really important part of my process, that I revise so much, but almost always before pieces go out into the world. And so it's not that I no longer see them as holding personal experience that has often a fair amount of charge to it, but it's I also, by virtue of having revisited the essay as a crafted thing, or the book as a crafted thing over and over again, it also very much, I have a relation to it as a crafted object, as a kind of sculpted thing. And so by the time it goes out into the world, I'm seeing it not as like just the raw material of what I've lived, but really as this thing that I've made. Which doesn't actually make you feel less vulnerable about it. Like if somebody has a problem with it, they have a problem with the thing you've made, not just the thing you've lived. But it does sort of, it inflects the experience in a particular way. Yeah, and there was somebody in the middle too.
So I'm curious, one thing I feel personally unites you and David Foster Wallace, your writing, is that you
I
both...
like this question already. Say no more,
Well,
yeah.
I just, like, you both feel fearlessly vulnerable. Like, I've always thought about David Foster Wallace's writing as extremely self-deprecating. That's where I think we feel very close to him when we read him. That's why we trust him. I see the same thing in your writing. And I'm curious because I love it and respect it so much in David Foster Wallace. When I try to do it myself, I feel like I always fail. Because I think there's a tendency to, when you're being fearlessly vulnerable, when you're talking about all the hard parts about yourself, when you're being self-deprecating, I think there's a tendency to be saturine, to borrow your phrase. I think there's a tendency to just give into it so much so that it feels fake, almost. How do you find yourself straddling the line when you're talking about those hidden parts of yourself? How do you find yourself trying to make it authentic to the point where it doesn't feel put on or affected?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so there's so much that feels right and intelligent to me in the framing of that question around essentially the ways that self-deprecation can become its own form of simplicity or reduction or its own sort of knee-jerk posture. I think part of why we're turned off by a certain sort of self-ennobling impulse on the page is that, among other things, not only do you not want to sit there hearing about what a wonderful person somebody is, but it just feels too reductive to be the truth. And I think that sometimes where people get confused, or certainly where I got confused, where I was first starting out as a writer, is I thought that the satisfying opposite of that one-note self-ennobling posture was a one-note posture of self-deprecation, where if I just said all the bad things about myself, or the preemptive self-excoriation could sort of, buy me endless vowels on the, Wheel of Fortune game of literature, that if I would sort of purchase the right to a reader's sympathy or a reader's attention just by saying enough bad stuff about myself before they could say it about me. But part of what I realized, and I think this gets to the kind of self-deprecation that feels inauthentic, it feels inauthentic when it's not complicated enough, when it doesn't, because nobody is all bad, whatever that would even mean, just in the same way that nobody's all good or all virtue. And so I think when we just hear that sort of defensive, fear-driven, endless impulse to self-implicate it can feel like it's crowding out the other parts of the truth in the same way that the self-ennobling account feels like part of why we're suspicious of it, is it feels like it's crowding out the other parts of the truth. And so I think for me it's like always about trying to let as much complexity in as possible, and maybe this connects to what you were saying about, anybody can feel ashamed, but the next layer of the piece is like how it can also feel proud. It's like, there's part of me that's like, oh God, I don't want to be the person who's like proud of dysfunction or something like that. But what I agree with in that is that feeling that's always more interesting if there are two things coming up against each other that conflict in some way. And I think that's why when self-deprecation feels unsatisfying, it's because there's not enough conflict or enough internal tension in it, and that both never rings true because lived experience is always full of contradiction and tension and things pointing in multiple directions, and it's also just less interesting when things aren't pointing in multiple directions.
Maybe time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, I know that this person has had her hand up for a little while.
All right.
My question is about doubt. Across your life, has there been a moment or a series of moments in which you've experienced kind of the most doubt about any theme, and then any takeaways from that?
Yeah, so I won't just deflect into Agee. I will answer that question in a personal way, but part of why I was excited to read from this piece was, maybe doubt isn't the right word. Maybe there was a kind of humbling that actually didn't create the doubt we might expect it to. But part of why I like this part of Agee's story is that he was humbled in this way. Fortune magazine didn't want the story that he'd written. The Guggenheim didn't want to give him a grant to write it again. When he did find a way to write it, nobody wanted to buy it. And that just feels like such an important part of the story to me, is those moments when the world sort of resists what you're trying to give it. And in a way, it's like, okay, we also see Agee's ego sort of raging against that. And, you know, when Fortune kills his piece, he says, well, it looks like I'm just going to have to invent some new forms of writing. You know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like the opposite of doubt. But there's also a way in which that, you know, I don't know where all the doubt and guilt and sort of constant self-questioning comes from in the pages of that book, but it's hard for me to believe it's completely independent of all the ways that his writing had been around that subject, had been resisted by the world. And so I think, to get to your question, one of the takeaways from my own experiences of doubt, and there have been many, you know, I think it's easy to look at the kind of paragraph bio of somebody's life and their book jacket or whatever, and you see all the things that they've done and all the ways that they've gotten the things that they wanted, and they've gotten the things they wanted to put on their book jacket. But, you know, in the midst of, in between the lines of what shows up in the book jacket are all sorts of, you know, I can remember actually, and it makes me sad that this probably isn't the case anymore, but I can remember going to the post office in Iowa City with my like stacks of manila envelopes of the stories that I was sending out, and none of them got published. And that sort of process of, you know, being young and wanting the world to be excited to read the things that I was making, and the world isn't always excited to read the things that you make, and it's still not excited to read all the things that I make. And so that kind of constant process of rejection, I can remember a particular bathroom stall in Iowa where I went after a workshop. I had workshopped a story about Vietnam War veterans who were living together on a houseboat in the Venice canals in California, and I thought it was like Agee thought. I thought I had maybe more or less invented some new forms of writing with this story. I wrote it exclusively between the hours of like midnight and 5 in the morning. I was writing at this like truck stop outside of town. I was like, you know, it just felt wild, and it like had emerged like Athena from the forehead of Zeus, except Zeus was like a fever dream I had in this truck stop. And then, you know, it was like getting a B+ in class. Like, people didn't hate it, they didn't love it. They were like, yeah, it was like had some interesting sentences. You know, it was like the least overwhelmed reaction you could possibly imagine. And my teacher just said, you know, I don't really know what to say about this story. I don't think I got it, you know, and that was like what he had to say. And so anyway, I remember going to this bathroom stall and just crying and really feeling like I thought I had done something special, and nobody else in that room thought that. And I just, you know, I think everybody comes up against some of those moments, and even in the moment, and maybe this is to get to letting things be complicated or the pride underneath the shame, I think there was also some part of me that felt glad to be feeling as much as I was feeling in that moment, to care enough that it kind of wrecked me, at least in that bathroom stall in that moment, that nobody else had seen on the page what I had wanted them to see or what I'd hoped was there for them. And so I guess that some of the takeaways are both that the ferocity with which doubt can strike, or the ways in which it can be crippling, are also often signs of investment and that kind of caring about the thing enough. So there's a way in which it can be read. The way of fever is your body fighting something off, is like a sort of symptom of the heat inside, or the desire inside. And also, I think there are things that doubt has to tell us about, you know, situations we might need to get out of, or stories that we might need to figure out how to tell a different way. And, you know, I think trying to exercise those muscles of learning to listen to what doubt might be trying to tell you, and then also those muscles of sort of, you know, lashing yourself to the mast like Odysseus and just trying to block it out, and how life has to involve navigating both that sort of listening and that self-faith of ignoring is like it's a necessary balance to learn how to hold both of those imperatives at once.
Final question.
Yes, thank you. All right, so this might be a minor local question, but maybe it'll lead somewhere valuable. I'm a big fan of The Recovering. Listened to it up and down to Vermont a couple of times this summer. And, was amazed by the close reading and the taking down of the myth of the alcoholic writer, that one must go with the other. The specific moment I want to ask about is buying Carolyn Knapp's Drinking a Love Story, I think over in the Harvard bookstore. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the few of them I had read, so I was looking forward to you going into it. But you didn't at all, and in fact, you didn't say the name. You had this beautiful moment about the martini glass on the cover and the word love in the title in an exchange with the bookseller. And I wonder if you could talk about your decision not to name her, not to name the book. Obviously, you got to edit somewhere, but just the crafting of that particular moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's actually a white wine glass on the cover of that book, which I only say because one of the things that I connected to so deeply in that book was the way that she talks about her relationship to white wine. And it's funny, a friend of mine,
What's the book, by the way?
the book is called Drinking a Love Story by Carolyn Knapp, Knapp,
PP.
and it's a beautiful, beautiful memoir about drinking and recovery. Yeah, and I will answer your question. I think, I had a friend who recently read my book, or The Recovering, and said that, he had really admired my writing, and he himself is sober, but did many other things that weren't white wine. And he said that he had really resisted reading the book because he felt like it was going to be a book about a white wine drunk, as her book is a book about a white wine drunk. And when he read it, I said, so what do you think? Was I a white wine drunk or what? And he was like, well, you really were a white wine drunk, but the book was really good anyway. And I realized, like, there is a lot of white wine in that book, but I was glad it had some useful things to say despite that. I think, and I think this actually connects back to Agee in an interesting way. Like, I loved Carolyn Knapp's book, and it was so important to me. It wasn't that I got sober right after I read it, but it stayed in me. It was like a little ticking time bomb for years. After I read it.
Did you read it before Recovery?
Yes,
Okay.
a couple years before. And I actually, like, you should never, like, confess this as a writer. I just sat on the floor of the bookstore and read it straight for, like, 3 hours, and then I didn't buy it, which is, like, is a real testament to the book that I was, like, so engrossed that I didn't. But then it's like, oh, but everybody should always buy the book. And I did buy it subsequently. Years later, but I think I didn't write extensively about it. I didn't write extensively about it because I wasn't wrestling with it in the way that I was wrestling with some of those other books. I just inhaled it, and I needed it, and I loved it, and I feel like it has all these important truths. But it's almost like if I were to write about that book, I would probably just quote long passages of it and with a big check mark next to them, and that's not necessarily what people need from me. But I feel like some of the writers that I come back to, it's not necessarily because they're the writers I love the most, although I do write about lots of writers that I've loved, but that they're writers that I'm thinking both with them and against them, and that there feels like something more productive about transcribing that engagement because it has a couple of more of a push-pull with it. And I write about, I probably never stop writing about Agee, but it's in part because my relationship with him is not that relationship of unequivocal love. I admire many things about him. I find his language fascinating and often inspiring. I find his relationship to failure aesthetically and structurally inspiring. But I also, he drives me crazy. I find him frustrating. I find him ethically problematic. It's like I find that his guilt takes up so much room on the page, and that's frustrating. And so, but it's because I'm sort of, part of me is loving him and part of me is railing against him. And I felt that with many of the writers who show up in The Recovering, there is somehow more of a push-pull. I love something about what they did with words, but there's also something I feel upset by in their legacies, either this kind of protective impulse around their self-destruction or, but there's something, there's a little bit more of a feeling of a struggle there, and that's what motivates the writing. And I'm not sure I had that sense of that struggle with her work.
And that was why you didn't mention her name? Was it the name or the title? Or
Yeah, I don't know if I
more
have
specific?
a smart an answer for why I
Right,
didn't mention the name of that book. I think I knew that anybody who knew that book would know from the mention of a love story.
what it was?
Yeah, and then it felt like there's an exchange with the bookstore clerk where he sort of comments on it being labeled a love story, and I think it felt, and like, what did that imply about what it was saying about alcohol? And I felt in the way that he said that he was also saying something about his own relationship to alcohol. But it felt sort of more powerful to me maybe to just embed the title in that moment of exchange rather than to sort of lay it out there and then have it come up in the exchange, to sort of let the love story come from his voice rather than my text.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Leslie. for a
Thank you.
wonderful evening.